All right, so welcome everyone to today's video, where I'm very pleased to be joined by Joe Schmid of Majesty of Reason, and we're going to talk about our forthcoming paper in the Journal of Philosophy. And we're going to, in particular, we're going to discuss various objections to that paper, and respond to those objections. I'm going to give an overview of the paper, but not go into significant detail. For those who want to learn more about it, you can either check out the paper itself, which is linked in the description on Phil Papers, or check out the video that Joe and I did on his channel. And that'll be linked as well. I assume most people who are watching this are already familiar with Majesty of Reason, but if you're not, you should definitely check it out. He makes a lot of great original philosophy content, and both academically and for his channel. So yeah, if you want to add anything there, Joe, feel free. But yeah, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And for the audience, we've had massive technical difficulties with this show, so just be kind to us. It's been a rough day. But yeah, let's go on.
Yeah. Hopefully it's good from here on out. But yeah, we should be fine. Yeah, so I guess I'll start with had a slideshow of just a bunch of things we're going to cover. Here's just a general overview of what we're going to look at today. By the way, if you want to submit your own sort of questions or objections or anything, feel free to do so in the chat. We could get to those at the end or throughout if we feel like it. So yeah, I'm going to give as I said, a brief overview of the argument, the original Grim Reaper argument from Robert Koons, and others have made sort of similar arguments. And then I'll give a bit of an overview of our paper responding to that. And then we'll go through some objections, including 3 from the paper, although we cover 6, and then some audience objections that, in particular from the video that we made previously. So yeah, and then if someone wants, and we'll wrap up. So yeah. I know what just happened there, but I got kicked out for a second. Can you still hear me?
Well, maybe.
Did it? I don't.
I mean, I don't hear it anymore.
Wait, actually? Okay.
Well, you'd have to continue talking for a little while, but keep going. Go on.
Yeah. Make sure the stream is still going. Yeah, we're good. Okay. All right. So yeah. So the general form of the Grim Reaper argument, or really it's an argument of a more general form that argues against certain finitist theses, in particular that there can't be a like beginningless past, or beginningless series of causes, or that time cannot be dense, that sort of thing. And the way they argue that is well, the following general form, right? So if temporal finitism is false, or whatever finitist thesis it's under consideration, then the Grim Reaper paradoxes are possible, or insert some other version of the scenario. But the Grim Reaper paradoxes are not possible, and so temporal finitism, or whatever finitist thesis is under consideration, is true. And in the Robert Koons article, he gives a further sort of argument for what here is listed as premise 4, in terms of well, I'll just put it down here. Should be able to go to the next slide. No? Oh, I can't go to the next slide. Hang on, I need to what? Okay, I think something happened with the slide, so let me just re-add the slideshow. Let me re-add the slides.
Everything that could possibly go wrong is in fact going wrong.
Okay. Yeah. Here we go. Yeah. So he gives what I've listed here is 1, 2, and 3 are sort of the assumptions. There's an additional assumption, but I'm not going to list it here for simplicity. This gives a rough overview of how the argument works, right? There's these 3 sort of assumptions that he uses for the argument, and then uses that to show that the finitist thesis is true. So the basic way, although I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, the basic way that the argument works is that we're considering Grim Reapers who have interesting attribute, which is that they're tasked with, depending on the version, say killing Fred at a particular time if Fred is still alive at that time. And what we were to imagine is that, well, okay, if these are possible individually and they sort of have that feature intrinsically, I'm not going to talk about what it is to be intrinsic here. Again, check out the paper or the other video for more on that. And if they have that power intrinsically, you could sort of, by the patchwork principle or the principle of recombination, we can infer that, well, you can have a series of them in a row, so to speak, where each one of them will kill Fred if and only if none of the earlier ones have killed Fred. So you could imagine 3 Reapers in a row, and Fred's there. Okay, the first Reaper is going to kill him, right? And so the second and the third one will not kill him. That's the idea. Now, the idea is that, well, if temporal finitism is false, and you can have this sort of infinite past, then we could imagine patching in infinitely many of them, extending back through that infinite past, or extending through ever shorter intervals of time, if time were dense. And what would result is either stretched out through the infinite past or just over a bounded interval of time of ever smaller intervals. A beginningless sequence of Reapers, each of which will perform a task if and only if none of the earlier ones will. And I'm not going to explain in detail, but it turns out that that's not possible. You can't have it where it's a beginningless sequence of anything that will, each of which will satisfy some feature if and only if none of the earlier ones do. Because, well, here's one way to think about it. If one of them were to kill Fred or satisfy the attribute, then it would follow that none of the earlier ones did. But then that's true also for the one right before it, right? Because it's true for that one that none of the earlier ones did. So it should have satisfied the condition. It should have killed Fred or done whatever it is. Given the example. But then if none of them could have killed Fred, then, well, none of them killed Fred, but certainly one of them must have killed Fred because if Fred were alive by the time the last one rolled around, that one would have killed him. It turns out this is just a paradox. It's inconsistent, and we can sort of show formally how that's the case, and that's discussed in a lot more detail in the paper, but I'll sort of leave it at that for now. But again, the sort of upshot of the argument is supposed to be that, look, these assumptions about Reapers and the patchwork principle are true, and the intrinsicality assumption as well. And it turns out that if you could have this infinite past or this dense temporal intervals, then, or time could be dense, then you really could infer the possibility of one of these Grim Reaper scenarios or these Grim Reaper type scenarios. But those scenarios are not possible. See Problems 5 here. And so we should just conclude that the finitist thesis is true. You just can't have this infinite past, or you can't have time be dense. And this is sometimes used as as support for the premise of the Kalam argument that the universe began to exist. But we're not focused on that. We're just focused on the argument itself, whether it's any good. And I think that's enough on that. If you want to add something on just the original Greenwood argument, you can if you want, but I think that's probably.
I think that's good. I mean, so long as we at least remind people what like P1 and P1 star and P2 and P2 star. So should I get into that now?
I have a slide. Yeah, well, I have the next slide where we give P1 star. And
okay.
P2
yeah.
star
So yeah, just
star.
for the audience, I mean, keep in mind that just P1 on the previous slide is just possible Reapers, right? So it says Reapers are individually possible. P2 is the Patrick principle, right? Like, so duplicates of individually possible spacetime regions can be freely recombined, and we can infer that the patched together world is possible, provided that there's a possible world with enough spacetime room to be able to fit that arrangement. That's P2. And then P3 is the intrinsicality assumption. So like whether or not a Reaper is realized power and disposition is going to be intrinsic to that Reaper in its corresponding region. So just keep those in mind. The P1 through P3, we're going to be making reference to them throughout the video.
Yeah, for sure. And then, yeah, so the general structure of our paper has kind of two main parts. I mean, the the main part really is our companions in guilt style argument against the Grim Reaper argument. And we'll give a brief overview of that. And then there's a second part which just raises a separate issue regarding intrinsicality. I'm not going to get into that right now anyway. But the way our companions in guilt argument works, it is the sort of general form of our companions in guilt argument. The idea is that, look, if P1, P2, and P3 are all true, recall what those were from the couple slides ago, then P1 star, P2 star, and P3 star are all true. But we can show that P1 star, P2 star, and P3 star are not all true, right? And so we conclude, just this is straightforward most Tollens, that it's not the case that P1, P2, and P3 are all true. But because P1, P2, and P3 are all required by the Grim Reaper argument, it follows from that the Grim Reaper argument is unsound. So that's a general form. And then the main sort of work in the paper is showing that first premise here is that the P1 star and P2 star and P3 star are sort of companions to P1, P2, and P3. And I'm not going to get into that now, but we sort of show that the premises are sort of similarly motivated, similarly plausible. In the case of P2 star and P2, they're actually just the same assumption. It's just the Patrick principle. And then regarding the second premise, it turns out that P1 star, P2 star, and P3 star themselves generate a paradox. So here was the basic statement of P1 star, P2 star, and P3 star. Oh, that says P2, P3 is twice, but it's meant to be P2 star. And I'll give a brief description of the scenario that we develop. It's sort of analogous to the Grim Reaper scenario or Bernardetti paradoxes, although it isn't strictly speaking of the same form. So the idea is that if you have like we're to imagine these bulbs, which are not ordinary bulbs, but they're bulbs with a very particular feature, which is that bulb is on if and only if no bulb to its left is on. Oh, I guess I'm reversed here, so I'm trying to think. For me, it's like I'm thinking backwards here. So, and a bulb is to the left of another bulb. If the bulb part of the one bulb is touching the electrical contact part of the other. So this one would count as being to the left of this one if they're connected like this. I don't know if you can see. And so in this case, if you had two connected like this one would be on, and this one would be off. And if you had three, like this, same difference. The first one would be on, and the rest would be off. I don't have four, but you get the picture. So that's the idea, and so that's the description of the way bulbs work. And yeah, maybe you could have inferred that, like, if you had a string of them, this one still counts as being to the left of the other two. But we formally state that property, and in the paper if you're confused, but that should give you a basic description of it. And so anyway, the idea is that if we give those assumptions, right, that bulbs are possible individually, and that power that they have to be on, if and only if none of the bulbs to its left are on, that property is intrinsic to them, or that power is intrinsic to them. Really, it's a realization of that power, but we don't need to get into that now. Then, given the Patrick principle, we can infer not just that you can have, say, longer strings of them, but that you could have them arranged in a circle, right? So imagine they came around in a circle. We did an example with 16, but it's not so important how many there are. You could just imagine a bunch of bulbs in a line that forms a circle. And that actually results in an inconsistent scenario, right? Because what would the state of the bulbs be in the circle? If any one of them was on, well, there would be a bulb to its left which is on. Actually, itself is to the left of itself, given the way the to the left of relation is defined. But since a bulb is only on if none of the bulbs to its left are on, it would have to be off. But then none of the bulbs could be off, because then, well, for each bulb, every bulb to its left would be off, and so it should be on. And so the point is you get an inconsistent result. And the main point of our parity or our companions in guilt style argument here is that, look, we're able to generate a similar paradox from assumptions which are kind of similarly plausible as those required by the Grim Reaper argument, without any sort of controversial infinitist assumptions, right, regarding space times or anything like that. Um, any sort of normal space time would do. Certainly, you could imagine bulbs arranged in a circle in our actual space time. So that's the basic idea. For any more detail on that, I'll just direct people to the paper or the other video. But yeah, again, if you want to add anything, I feel like that probably gets the gist across.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. Again, because we're going to be using these terms later on, the audience should be very clear that just as P1 is stating that reapers are individually possible, P1 star is saying that bulbs are individually possible, the bulbs of the specified kind that you just mentioned. P2 star is the exact same as P2. It's just the Patrick principle, allows us to freely recombine individually possible regions. And then P3 star is exactly similar to P3. Remember, P3 states that the realization of a reaper's power and disposition is intrinsic. Likewise, P3 star says the realization of a bulb's power and disposition are intrinsic to it. So just keep those in mind, the kind of P1s and P2s and blah, 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 as well as the stars.
Yeah. And then, as I said already, the sort of near the end of our paper, we raise another issue for the Grim Reaper argument having to do with a problem concerning intrinsicality. I'm not going to talk about that now. I think we have a question about that that we're going to cover, so we'll talk about that more when that comes up. But yeah, I mean, the bulk of the paper though is on concerned with our companions in Gil's style argument. But I think the other issue is serious though, and raises some problems for it. Also, again, I think I mentioned this already, but there are probably even further problems for the Grim Reaper argument, and Joe has some published works on those and discussed them on his channel as well, so you can check that out. But yeah. Anyway, so yeah, we're gonna, in the paper we discussed 6 potential objections and go into a lot of detail in response to those. For our purposes now, we'll just cover 3 and then turn to some audience questions. So yeah, I think Joe, you would want to take the first one. So
yeah, so like you said, we'll do 3 objections from our paper, and then we'll go to the objections that people leveled under the video that Troy and I made, which is linked in the description. Okay, so yeah, the first objection that we're going to be covering is worry 1 from our paper. And here's how we can state the objection. It's on the slide. Because the state of a bulb instantaneously influences the states of any rightward bulbs, P1 star, which is the claim that bulbs are individually possible, requires the possibility of instantaneous action at arbitrary distances. But then, so the objection goes, there's a relevant disanalogy between P1 star and P1, which again is the claim that reapers are individually possible. That's P1, right? After all, like P1, unlike P1 star, does not require us to commit to the dubious possibility of instantaneous action at arbitrary distances. So there's a kind of asymmetry between the P1 and P1 star. P1 star requires the possibility of instantaneous action at a distance. P1 does not. Okay. So here's how we respond to this. We give more responses in the paper, and our discussion there is very involved. But here's the kind of popular presentation. We do think this is a difference between P1 and P1 star, but it doesn't seem to us to be like a relevant difference between them. That is like a difference between them, which kind of makes P1 star considerably less plausible than P1. And that's really what the objector needs to pinpoint. It can't just be a difference. After all, a difference between P1 and P1 star is that P1 star concerns bulbs and P1 concerns reapers. But that's not, by itself, that's not like a relevant difference between the premises. What we need is a relevant difference between them. That is a difference between them, which makes P1 star considerably less plausible than P1. So much so that even though we should accept P1, we should not accept P1 star. And so again, we grant that this is a difference between P1 and P1 star, but it doesn't seem to us to be a relevant difference. Why is that? Well, there are several ways one could understand this sort of instantaneous influence, right? Like a bulb may indirectly affect the state of any rightward bulb by instantaneously propagating some information-carrying signal to it. Another option is that a bulb might directly induce the states of any rightward bulb without sending some sort of intermediary information carrier. Or a bulb state might ground or non-causally determine the states of rightward bulbs. And finally, a bulb state might just brutally correlate or covariate with the states of rightward bulbs. These represent 4 different options for understanding this sort of instantaneous action at a distance. And the crucial question that we need to ask then is, does P1 star's unique commitment to the possibility of instantaneous action at a distance render P1 star so much less plausible than P1 to the point that we shouldn't accept P1 star even if we accept P1? That's the crucial question here. And in our view, the answer is no. And we give a few reasons for this. First, P1 also has unique commitments to seemingly equally dubious possibilities. So for instance, to run the Grim Reaper argument, or GRA, against beginningless sequences of ever smaller intervals of time scrunched into a finite period of time, P1 needs to commit to the possibility of Reapers capable of acting arbitrarily quickly and placing particles arbitrarily precisely in space. Needless to say, if a bulb's instantaneous action breaks the actual laws of physics by, say, breaking the finite speed of causal transmission, and if that somehow gives us reason to think that bulbs are metaphysically impossible, well, then Reapers likewise break the actual laws of physics, and so it would also be metaphysically impossible by the same token. And just more generally, the possibility of mechanisms capable of instantaneous action at a distance doesn't seem to us considerably less plausible than the possibility of mechanisms capable of acting arbitrarily quickly and arbitrarily precisely. So that's the first kind of response, or the first kind of reason why we think this isn't a relevant difference between P1 and P1 star. A second point is that it just doesn't strike us as plausible that committing to the bare possibility of instantaneous action at a distance is a serious mark against P1 star. Why should that sort of action be completely metaphysically impossible? In fact, we have good positive grounds for thinking that it is possible. After all, it seems to be intuitively possible, it's entirely consistent, it's both conceivable and imaginable, it's a kind of action that differs in mere quantity from other kinds of action that are known to be possible, and differences in mere quantity don't typically make for a categorical difference in whether something is possible, and so on down the list of reasons for thinking instantaneous action at a distance is possible. In fact, Newtonian universes, that is, universes obeying Newtonian mechanics, are often quite plausibly taken to be at least metaphysically possible. Yet Newtonian gravity involves direct, instantaneous action at spatial distances. What's more, the Bohmian interpretation of quantum mechanics, as well as the handful of non-local interpretations of quantum mechanics, posit instantaneous action at arbitrary distances. Surely at least one of these interpretations is at least metaphysically possible. And able philosophers of physics, like Tim Maudlin, have actually argued that non-locality is actually true. And finally, a direct or instantaneous causation between non-spatial and spatial things is very plausibly possible. So, for example, surely some possible world contains embodied organisms for whom interactionist dualism is true. That seems like a bare possibility. And likewise, theistic proponents of the Grim Reaper argument, it seems like they have to grant that a non-spatial God can directly and instantaneously affect space. But there doesn't seem to us, at least, to be a relevant difference between that sort of direct causation and direct causation between spatially distant things that could account for why the former, but not the latter, is metaphysically possible. To us, they seem like they stand or fall together in terms of whether they're possible. So all in all, we think that the companionship between P1 and P1 star is on good footing. P1 star should not be considered significantly less plausible than P1 by virtue of P1 star's commitment to the possibility of instantaneous action at a distance.
Yeah, good. Yeah, and as you said, it might not even require action at a distance. It could be something like bare correlation, or
right.
There's other options that you give as well. At least one of those, it seems possible. As you argue, I think probably all of them are possible. Maybe the determination one is not a correct description here, but at the very least, it seems like the rest are plausible. Yeah, okay, so then we'll move on to the second worry from the paper. Actually, this is worry 3 in the paper, but it's the second one that we're going to look at. And this worry has to do with whether circular or infinite dependence chains are possible. The idea is that, look, the state of each bulb depends on the state of the bulb to its left, which depends on the bulb to its left, and so on ad infinitum. And since each bulb is to the left of itself, its state depends on itself as well. and that requires a potentially problematic sort of circular dependence. So you get both this circular dependence, or where the dependence is reflexive, a bulb depends on its own state, and a sort of infinite chain, beginningless sequence of dependence. And the worry is that one or both of those dependent structures are impossible. And I guess the problem is supposed to be, if that's the case, then, well, maybe we should worry about the possibility of bulbs, or at least the truth of the assumptions required for the bulb parity. All right, so there's a few problems for this worry. First, the bulb parity arguably doesn't require any infinite dependence chain, since the state of each bulb only depends on finally many other states, right? If there's, say, 16 bulbs in a circle, then the state of one bulb depends on the state of, well, the 16 bulbs in that circle, not infinitely many. Second, it's not obvious, at least to us, that infinite or circular dependence chains of the sort required for the bulb parity are actually impossible. While a lot more could be said about this, it actually doesn't matter, since our argument doesn't require that such chains are possible. The possibility of such change is merely a consequence of P1 star through P3 star plus H1 star, which is an additional assumption I'm not going to get into now. It's not as if the possibility of infinite dependence chains or circular dependence chains is an additional claim that could be dismissed in order to preserve the assumptions, right? Again, our argument is essentially, since P1 star through P3 star is not less plausible than P1 through P3, and since P1 star through P3 star is false, that therefore P1 through P3 is false. If it turns out that the dependence chains required for the bulb parity are impossible, then so be it. Our argument proceeds in the exact same way, right? That would be another consequence of the sort of absurd scenario. But so what? We agree that the scenario is absurd. It still undermines the validity or the soundness of the claimed companion argument, that is the Grimm-Hooper argument. Perhaps someone may follow up by saying that the fact that P1 star through P3 star and H1 star entails the possibility of such change undermines those assumptions in a way that P1 through P3 are not analogously undermined, thereby weakening their companionship and to our argument. And so the thought there might be, look, okay, these are a consequence of P1 star through P3 star, but that actually counts against the sort of plausibility of P1 star through P3 star, and we don't have something sort of analogously counting against P1 through P3. And if you have something that very strongly counts against P1 star through P3 star, then maybe it's not the case that those assumptions are similarly plausible. They're not really genuine companions with P1 through P3. So that's the idea. Well, we respond by saying, look, supposing that those sorts of dependence chains, or at least one of them, is impossible, it's not clear to us that this would seriously undermine our case, since the considerations we use in support of the companionship, we argue, are still stronger than the considerations that undermine that companionship. For more on this point, see worry 2 from the paper. Of course, we leave it open that someone could present some consideration or a series of considerations that undermine our case and show that some of the assumptions in our companions and guilt case are not relevantly analogous or not similarly plausible to the original assumptions. We leave it open that could be done. It's just that we think that the case for their companionship, as best we can tell, is much stronger than the case against it. But if someone wants to make something up, then they're free to do so. Okay, good. And then I'll just cover one more worry from the paper, and then we'll get into some audience objections. So this is worry 4 from the paper, the third one and final one that we'll cover now. So here's the thought. Okay, since bulbs cannot possibly be arranged in a loop, it seems that there would have to be some kind of mysterious force preventing someone from trying to form a bulb loop, right? You can imagine yourself with a few bulbs, like on a table, and as you or someone endeavors to arrange them into a loop, like the mighty hand of logic itself has to intervene to thwart the resultant explosion, pun intended. Of course, logic has no hands, and can play no causal role like this. The worry is that bulbs with a characteristic bulb power and disposition would require logic to play a causal role like this. And since it can't, bulbs are not possible. This is analogous to the mysterious force objection in the context of the grandfather paradox. Maybe some people are familiar with that. But anyway, again, yeah, the thought is that, look, um, something has to prevent these bulbs from being arranged into a circle. But what could it be? It seems that just like logic itself would have to play that role. But since it can't, um, the bulbs couldn't even be possible in the first place. That's the basic idea. So, how do we respond? Uh, while we agree that logic can't play that role, it doesn't do things in the world like prevent loops of bulbs or whatever. um, we don't agree that that would have to be the case in order to account for um, why loops could never be formed, right? So, as you or someone were configuring the bulbs on the table in front of you, one or more of a few things might happen. One, at some time before being arranged to a circle, one or more of the bulbs would lose or fail to realize its characteristic power and disposition. Right? This isn't so strange. Things routinely lose or fail to realize their powers and dispositions. We shouldn't think that that's an impossibility in the case of bulbs. One bulb might just have fail to work on some occasion when you put them into a circle. Anyway, a second possibility is that just any attempt to arrange the bulbs into a circle fails. Not because logic intervenes, but for some other reason. Again, this is not so unusual. Perhaps you change your mind as you try to put them into a circle. Maybe you slip on a banana peel and just fail to succeed in arranging them into a circle. Maybe you accidentally break the bulbs or whatever. The possibilities are sort of endless. But the point is that these are possible outcomes, which result in no paradoxical scenario, and also don't require logic to intervene to make it the case that that happens. So these possibilities and this like kind of style reply is similar to that made by David Lewis regarding time travel in the grandfather paradox. But that's the basic idea in that one. And then the third possibility is that, well, upon being arranged into a circle, at least one of the bulbs ceases to exist. Perhaps what persists is like a regular light bulb or maybe something else. And this option might sound a little bit strange, but actually, I think it's fairly mundane. So consider a sort of analogous case or potentially analogous case if this is what would happen with bulbs. Uh, what would happen if you moved a planet into interstellar space? Like, could you do that? In principle, right? In one sense, you couldn't do that because planets essentially orbit stars. I mean, part of what it is to be a planet is to orbit a star or the sun. And if you moved a planet away from a star so that it's not orbiting a star, well, it wouldn't be a planet anymore. So well, you would fail to move a planet into interstellar space not because the celestial body in question wouldn't move. Supposing you could do that, um, it would you would fail because when moved, it would cease to qualify as a planet. It would be something else. I don't know, some just interstellar celestial body. Um, and the thought is that it might be the same thing here, right? You could move these kind of bulb-shaped objects into a circle, but in doing so, at least one of them would cease to count as a bulb, right? So, is this what would happen? Well, it's a possibility, it seems, and all that's sort of required to respond to this uh, mysterious force objection is that there's other possibilities beyond, well, logic would have to intervene, and this is just the third one. Also, I should add, there could be other strange possibilities as well. Like maybe when you try to arrange them into a circle, at least one of the bulbs like vanishes or is replaced by something wholly unlike bulbs. And while that may be even more strange than some of the other options, uh, it's not clear that it should be counted as impossible, especially if we accept the kind of recombination principles assumed by the Green Group argument itself, right? In fact, those sorts of possibilities seem to be a consequence of the Patrick principle, not something that would be rejected. Anyway, we go into more details on these options and how we respond to this worry in the paper, but that should give you a decent overview. And these options could be explored further and considered for which is most like plausible or likely to occur in any given situation. But all that's required for our argument, in respect to this worry, anyway, is that at least one of these is possible, which to us seems quite obvious. So accordingly, we can safely dispense with the worry that this sort of mysterious force-style objection undermines the possibility of bulbs. All right. All right. So I guess next we just had some. So that's it for the worries from the paper that we were going to cover, and then we had a few from the video, as Joe mentioned. Starting with this one. This was one of yours, right?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. So onwards we march to some of the lovely commenters who gave their wonderful thoughts. We do appreciate these. This objection is saying, since your companions in guilt argument doesn't contain an infinite linearly ordered set, it doesn't seem to be sufficiently Benerdetti-like. And so I don't think it's analogous to the GRA, or the Grim Reaper argument. In response to this, importantly, our companions in guilt argument doesn't rely on our bulb paradox being sufficiently Benerdetti-like. Instead, it simply relies on the claim that if P1 through P3 are true, then P1 star through P3 star are also true, together with the claim that at least one of P1 star through P3 star is false. Neither of these premises relies on the bulb paradox, sharing all the features in common with traditional Benerdetti paradoxes. Even if the bulb paradox doesn't share some features in common with traditional Benerdetti paradoxes, such as an infinite linearly ordered set, it remains the case that the motivations for each of P1 through P3 equally carry over to P1 star through P3 star, and hence our companions in guilt argument remains in full force. In short, the difference the objector pinpoints between traditional Benerdetti paradoxes and our bulb paradox is not a relevant difference. That is, a difference that would make a difference to our companions in guilt argument, that would somehow make P1 star considerably less plausible than P1, or P2 star considerably less plausible than P1, or P3 star considerably less plausible than P1, etc. So, in short, I just don't think that this objection, this consideration, this difference between our arguments, it doesn't really affect the truth of either of our premises of our companions in guilt argument, and it also doesn't touch the justification that we offered for those premises. So I don't think this objection succeeds, although of course we do appreciate the commenter leveling it. So let's go on to the next audience objection. This objection is that it seems nonsensical to say that a light bulb could be to the left of itself. Now, in response to this, we simply stipulated a sense of to the left of at issue. And the stipulated sense allows something to be to the left of itself. Right? There's nothing nonsensical in our stipulated sense. The sense at issue was stated in the video, right? The video that we made and that this commenter commented on. Bulb A is to the left of bulb B, just in case either the glass of bulb A is touching the electrical contact of bulb B, or there's a sequence of bulbs from bulb A to bulb B that touch each other in this way. Notice that there can be a sequence of bulbs from a bulb to itself which touch each other in this specified way, right? Simply arrange the bulbs into a circle as we depicted in our video, and that condition is then satisfied. So our stipulated sense of to the left of is perfectly sensible, and it allows bulbs to be to the left of themselves. And, listen, if we don't like calling the relevant relation to the left of, this is purely a verbal dispute. Like we can call the relation to the schmeft of. So a bulb is then able and disposed to be on if and only if no bulb to its schmeft is on. And bulbs can be to the schmeft of themselves given our stipulated sense of schmeft. Okay, so we don't think that objection succeeds. But this objector also points out, if you go to the next slide, that if it's not nonsensical to say that a light bulb is to the left of itself, then it doesn't seem you could ever say that any light bulb is on, because then a light bulb to the left of itself would always be on, making it impossible to ever turn that light bulb on. So in response to this, it's easily possible for there to be a light bulb that is on and that is in fact turned on as well. just imagine a single light bulb alone in the world. A bulb is able and disposed to be on if and only if there are no bulbs to its left that are on. Well, since this bulb is alone in its world, right, there are no bulbs to its left that are on, and hence this bulb would be on. So it's entirely possible for a bulb to be on, right? Or consider a two-bulb world where bulb number 1 is to the left of bulb number 2. Here, there is no bulb to the left of bulb number 1, and hence there is no bulb to the left of bulb number 1 that is on. And so, since any given bulb is able and disposed to be on, if and only if there is no bulb to its left that is on, it follows that bulb number 1 is on. Bulb number 2 is then off, since there is a bulb to its left that's on, namely bulb number 1. Once again, this is entirely possible, and so it's entirely possible for a bulb to be on. And again, consider that two bulb case again. It's easily possible for bulb 2 to be turned on, right? All you need to do is disconnect it, like break them apart, such that the electrical contact is not touching the bulb of the other bulb, right? Once you do that, bulb number 2 will then go from a state of being off to being on, because now there are no bulbs to its left. So the objector's mistake is in assuming that there would always have to be a bulb that is on to the left of any given bulb. That's not true, right? That's a mistake. Nothing forces there to even be a bulb to the left of any given bulb. And so it's not true that there would always have to be a bulb that is on to the left of any given bulb. Again, return to the previously mentioned worlds, right? In both of them, there is some bulb that doesn't even have a bulb to its left. And so there is some bulb that doesn't have a bulb to its left that's on. Okay. Now, so we don't think that objection succeeds, but this objector also continues. Hold on a second. I think, can you go back? There is another point that this objector had. Yeah, wait. Okay, so I see
I might have skipped one.
Yeah, so I mean, listen, this objector continues by saying, like, they still do think that if we say that it's not nonsensical for a bulb to be to the left of itself, well, then we have a situation where no bulb could ever turn on, because then there would be a situation where that bulb would require itself to be off, which seems to avoid the contradiction, making premise 2 of our argument false. That's what this objector said in their comment. But as explained above, it's not true that any given bulb would require itself to be off. Again, return to the single bulb world, right? In that case, the bulb certainly doesn't require itself to be off. In fact, its ability and disposition require it to be on in those circumstances. And as for premise 2 in our argument, nothing the objector says here avoids the contradiction that we derived. That part of our argument should be uncontroversial since, I mean, we could just formally prove a contradiction from the relevant assumptions, and we go through that in the paper. So, and in the video that we made as well, I gave a kind of like 17-step deduction or whatever. So let's move on to the next objection from the audience, which is, well, what if someone responded by saying, hey, time isn't cyclical? So the analogy with the light bulbs, that's actually disanalogous after all, right? On the Grim Reaper argument, that involves intervals of time, which are linear. But on our model, its bulbs are arranged in a circle. This would be an attempt to reject premise 1 of our argument, because if the light bulb illustration is disanalogous, well, then someone could say that, even if P1 through P3 are true, it doesn't then follow that P1 star through P3 star are true. Now, in response to this, the bulbs in our paradox are not arranged in a temporal circle so that time is somehow like cyclical in our example. Instead, the bulbs in our paradox are arranged in a spatial circle. And there's nothing controversial about the possibility of spacetimes that can harbor spatially circularly arranged entities, right? Like our spacetime can accommodate such arrangements. Like I could go over to Myers and like buy 16 light bulbs and arrange them in a circle, right? So the objection here rests on a misunderstanding of our case. But we really do. Again, we don't want to give the impression that we don't appreciate these objections. We absolutely love that people are thinking through these objections or these arguments for themselves, and they're engaging with stuff that we've published. Like this is the dream for an academic, that people are actually taking what they say seriously and really reflecting on it and digesting it and coming up with responses to it. So we really do appreciate these things, even if we don't think they succeed.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so I'll take the next one then. So this commenter said, well, look, an event can't affect another if light doesn't have enough time to travel between them. They say they don't know if we account for that. So I take it that the worry here is that bulbs are impossible, and so P1 star is false, because they would have to have the power and disposition to influence or correlate or do something to other bulbs at superluminal speeds, faster than light speeds. But if superluminal influence or whatever the relation between them is um, required by the bulb patchwork inference, and this sort of influence is not possible, then our bulb patchwork inference goes wrong. And if it goes wrong in a way that undermines its companionship with the GRA, then our companionship argument is similarly undermined. So we have three main problems with this. First, this sort of power is arguably not required given our characterization of bulbs and their characteristic power and disposition. So recall the first objection that we covered, which was objection 1 from the paper. Well, therein we consider various ways in which the power might be realized, and it's not always that, or it's not clear that it has to be that they're influencing other bulbs. Rather, the relation could be something other than causation or influence like that. Second, and perhaps more importantly, while faster than light travel or influence may be like a nomological impossibility, it might contradict certain physical laws. It is very plausibly possible in a broader sense, such as some metaphysical possibility, for example. And it is that sort of possibility that is the typical target of these arguments. And to that point, actually, the third issue is that the version of the Grim Reaper argument that involves Reapers acting over sort of arbitrarily short intervals will itself require superluminal speeds, right? Because you have to have a Reaper that can kill Fred or place a particle or transmit a message over an arbitrarily short interval of time, and that's going to require fast and light movement or transition of information. And so, if you're objecting to the bulb parity on the basis that it requires this superluminal influence or transmission of information, then at least that version of the Grim Reaper argument itself should be undermined as well. But again, see the other responses that I just gave, which is then it's not clear that it requires that influence, and that sort of influence, even if it's some sort of nomological impossibility, it's not clear, and it plausibly isn't the case that it's a impossibility in the broader sense. But yeah, I'll leave it there. I don't think this is a too serious of a worry, but again, thanks for the commenter for providing it. Yeah, so we can go on to the next one. Number 6 here.
Okay. Yeah. So this objector thinks that we, and I agree with them, that we soundly argued our case. I agree that our arguments are sound. So, but they say it's of little consequence to their own beliefs, since they reject the implied assumption that time is non-discrete, and discrete time invalidates both the GRA and the bulb arguments, according to this objector. So again, we thank the objector for the nice comment, but there are three issues here. First, nothing in our companions in guilt argument with bulbs relies on the continuity or non-discreteness of time. We did not develop a super task where infinitely many bulbs act in increasingly shorter intervals. Instead, the bulbs are just sensitive to what is currently the case in spatial regions to their left. This could easily happen in a discrete spacetime, where a bulb's state at a discrete moment m depends on whether there's a bulb to its left at m. Second, the continuity of time is relevant only to one version of the GRA, namely the one intended to show that there can't be beginningless sequences of ever smaller intervals of time scrunched into a finite period of time. The version of the GRA that targets the possibility of an infinite past doesn't at all rely on non-discrete time. Third, and finally, this isn't even a good objection to the version of the GRA intended to show that there can't be beginningless sequences of ever smaller intervals of time scrunched into a finite period of time. That argument doesn't rely on time being non-discrete. Instead, it assumes for reductio that time is non-discrete, and then proceeds to argue that this implies a contradiction when conjoined with allegedly plausible premises, like the Patrick principle, etc. Thereby concluding, thereby the argument itself concluding that time is discrete. So this isn't even a good objection to either version of the GRA, and it also doesn't target our argument. So yeah, let's move on to the next objection from the audience.
All right. Uh, okay, so this person said, my first instinct upon watching, which gives me pause about the argument in regards to your finite bulbs example, is that each member is its own defeater, as each bulb is to the left of itself in the sequence. If a bulb was lit or turned on, then it itself serves to prove that it cannot be lit or turned on, independent of the status of any other bulbs in the sequence. So, yeah, so when bulbs are arranged into a loop, it is right that any particular bulb cannot be on because that would entail that there is a bulb to its left that is itself that is on. That's a sufficient condition for it being off. If this is what's meant by each bulb serving its own defeater, then that's right. Yeah. So what? This is just part of how we show that the bulb scenario isn't possible. That's integral to our case. So it's not clear to me what the problem here is supposed to be. Perhaps the objector means to say that bulbs being their own defeater in this way, well, like Grim Reapers in the GRA are not, right, is a relevant difference between the arguments. And that maybe undermines the companionship between the GRA and our bulb parity. However, it's not enough, again, it's not enough to point to a difference between the cases and say that it's a relevant difference. How is this difference relevant? If it is relevant, it must either show that, at least one of our parity premises is much less plausible than its corresponding GRA premise, or that our motivation for the comparable plausibility is inadequate. It doesn't appear to me that any reasonable case can be made given this consideration, but the objector or whoever thinks there's something to this line of reasoning, they're free to try to develop their concern. But we don't think there's much here to cause us any pause. But yeah, so with that, we'll go to the next objection.
I reject the claim that Reapers are possible. So, listen, this probably wasn't being posed as an objection to our video, but we did want to briefly respond to it nonetheless. First, note that our case, at least, doesn't rely on the Reapers being possible, right? It only relies on the claim that if Reapers are possible, then bulbs are possible too. Right? That doesn't require us to say that Reapers are possible. And second, it's not a good objection to the original Grim Reaper argument, or at least the version thereof that targets an infinite past, that Reapers are impossible, right? I mean, that's because the argument can be run with entities other than Reapers, including humans. So, I mean, after all, humans can be able and disposed to act if and only if no previous human acts. And so the argument can be run with humans instead of Reapers, and you wouldn't be able to deny that humans are possible, at least, I think. Now, of course, the argument would still succumb to the many objections that we've both published on, but that's a separate story.
Okay, sorry, I had something on my screen. Yeah, so the next one we're going to cover sort of the person left a long comment, which we definitely appreciate. I'm gonna show all of it over 3 slides, but yeah. So I'll just start. Maybe I'll go a little bit quickly through it, and then we'll get to the objection. So this person said, "I struggle with the second objection at 3450, which may well be a problem with my understanding rather than the objection itself." So this has to do with the intrinsicality issue that we raised towards the end of the paper. I didn't sort of explain that here, but hopefully through this question and my response to it, you should get a good idea. But again, check out the paper for more on that if you're interested, or again, the video. But anyway, the person says, so there's 2 regions, R1 and R2, each of which contain Reapers that have the intrinsic disposition to create and place a particle at a location if and only if no particle was already placed there. In each individual region, the Reaper creates and places a particle, realizing its disposition. Then, with the assumption that there's a possible spacetime region big enough to house R1 and R2, we infer via the patchwork principle that there is a possible patched together spacetime region R star, which jointly contains exact duplicates of R1 and R2, R1 star and R2 star. So far, so good. Now, the inconsistency is supposedly derived from the fact that since R1 and R2 star are exact duplicates, the Reapers must be realizing their dispositions to create and place a particle at that region. Yet the second Reaper in the sequence can't realize their disposition in the patched together region because the particle is already created by the first Reaper. The commenter goes on to say, my problem is this. It seems like there are two ways of understanding the contents of the region R1 and R2, but on either understanding, I don't see how you can successfully derive a contradiction. The first understanding is where R1 and R2 each can be divided into a subregion containing just the Reaper and the intrinsic powers and dispositions, S1 and S3, well, for those for the subregions, and a subregion containing a particle each Reaper creates, S2, S4. The duplicate regions will indeed have the exact same subregions and contents, leading us to the inference that in R star, you have two Reapers creating particles. But this doesn't contradict them having the disposition to create a particle if and only if no early Reaper does. They're both able to create a particle in their subsequent subregions, S2 and S4, because no earlier Reaper placed a particle there. All you can infer is that the Reaper later in the sequence can't place a particle in the same subregion, say S2, as the Reaper earlier in the sequence, because that Reaper would have already created and placed a particle in S2. But that doesn't stop the later Reaper from creating and placing a particle in their own subregion, S4. So there's no contradiction here. Both Reapers can realize their dispositions. They go on to say, that brings us to the second understanding. The regions R1 and R2 only contain the Reapers, but not any subregions containing particles. And they're both in a sequence to place a particle at precisely the same location L, and will only place it if and only if no early Reaper did. In this case, the Reaper which is earlier in the sequence will place the particle at L, but the later Reaper won't, due to their intrinsic disposition to place a particle if and only if none was yet placed. But we can see there's no contradiction here either. R1 star and R2 star are still duplicates of R1 and R2, since they contain the same Reapers with the same dispositions and properties. There's no issue with one having a particle and the other not, because X hypothesi neither contained a particle in the first place. If I'm right, there's basically a dilemma here. Either we think of R1 and R2 as having a subregion containing the particle created by each Reaper, in which case the inference from them being duplicates of them both creating a particle goes through, but we cannot infer that they can't create a particle from their intrinsic dispositions. They can both create a particle in their own subregion. Or we don't think of R1 and R2 as having subregions containing the created particles, in which case we can infer from their intrinsic dispositions that if a Reaper creates and places a particle at some location, the later Reaper can't. But now we can't infer from them being duplicates that each region R1 and R2 has the Reaper creating a particle. In fact, neither of them do. So that's their sort of lengthy comment there. Make sure I'm on the last page. So definitely want to thank this commenter for a very thoughtful and detailed response. They clearly followed the example and we're trying to raise an issue with it, although I don't think it's ultimately correct. So as I understand it, the objector presents a dichotomy concerning the worry we present regarding the intrinsicality assumption. Recall, the issue was this, and this is more for people who aren't familiar with it, but if you've read it or are familiar with it already, good for you, thank you. But for you and everyone else, we're supposed to imagine that you can have Reapers that are possible individually. Like you can have, say, one Reaper creating a particle or killing Fred or whatever it is at some region, at some possible world. And you could have another Reaper doing that same task, at another region, at another possible world. And they could have that, characteristic power to kill Fred if and only if he's not been killed already, or place a particle at a location if no particle has been placed already, or whatever it is. That those are possible scenarios. And then with the patchwork principle, we could infer that, well, you could have those Reapers sort of in a sequence. But what the patchwork principle does is preserve the exact contents of the regions from the original worlds used in the patchwork inference. So what you would get is that, you'd have two Reapers in a sequence, both creating and placing a particle, or killing Fred, or doing whatever it is that the Reapers are supposed to do. But that's not right, because by the intrinsicality assumption, only the first Reaper in the sequence should be doing that, right? If the first Reaper kills Fred or creates a particle, then the second Reaper should not be doing the same action. That's just what the successful realization of the Reaper power and disposition is, right? So this is the apparent inconsistency in the assumptions required for the Grim Reaper argument that we develop in the paper. Anyway, back to the objection that or worry that the commenter raised here. They say, if it's true, yeah, that R1 at W1 contains an active Grim Reaper, and R2 at W2 contains an active Grim Reaper, and each Reaper has its characteristic power and disposition intrinsically, we can employ the Patrick principle to infer the possibility of a world W prime containing R1 prime and R2 prime, or star, whatever symbol you want to use, in sequence. Again, as I just sort of said, the problem is we are apparently able to infer inconsistent conclusions about what the Reapers are doing, in particular what the second Reaper is doing at the patch together world. On one hand, it should be active by creating a particle or killing Fred, because its counterpart at the original region was active. But on the other hand, it should not be active, because that's what's required for it to be realizing its power and disposition. Now, the objector considers two ways of construing the regions involved in this patchwork inference. Either the patches at the source world include subregions containing or potentially containing particles, or they do not, and the particle is external to those regions. If the former, so the commenter says, then Grim Reaper 1 prime and Grim Reaper 2 prime, those at the patch together world, both create particles at R1 prime and R2 prime respectively. Grim Reaper 2 prime creating and placing a particle is compatible with its realizing its power and disposition, because no particle has already been placed at that location, that is at R2 prime, or the subregion S4. So, and then if it's the latter option, then GR1 prime counts as creating and placing a particle, whereas GR2 prime does not, even though internal to their own region, the Reapers are quite the same. And the point is that either way, there is no inconsistency, and so objection in section 3 fails. So, okay, finally, to respond to this, the first interpretation is correct in the sense that Reapers create and place a particle in their spatio-temporal region, sort of at the patch, like in which they're located. But it's incorrect that the location at which a particle is to be placed exists only as a part of that spatio-temporal region. Rather, the location here is merely a spatial location, which exists sort of over time, in the same way that I might create a particle here, like at one time, say now, or at another time now, right? This is what's going on in the Grim Reaper inference, right? So you have one Reaper one time. If a particle hasn't been placed there, it places the particle there. The next Reaper comes along, so to speak, and if there's no particle there, it puts a particle there, and so on. It's not concerned with just the sort of space-time points within its space-time region, right? It's concerned with the location, which sort of extends before and after, potentially, its particular space-time region, in the same way that the location right in front of me was there before I started talking and after. I'll leave aside technical worries concerning talk of the same spatial but not spatial temporal location. I could see some people potentially getting having certain general relativistic worries or something like that, but whatever. I'm leaving that aside, since the GRA effectively assumes that any such worries are not serious as well, and we're happy to grant that for sake of argument. Note also that if the first interpretation were correct, then the Grim Reaper argument itself would be plainly unsound, since the inferred world containing the Reapers in sequence will involve each of the infinitely many Reapers creating and placing a particle at its respective subregion. while realizing its characteristic power and disposition. That scenario is just not paradoxical, or at least not evidently paradoxical, and so the GRA would not go through. Um, so it turns out that the first interpretation, or the first sort of horn of the dilemma presented, is sort of correct, but not correct in the way that the commenter thinks. And if it were correct in the way the commenter thinks, then yeah, it's true you wouldn't get a paradox in the bulb scenario, but you wouldn't get a paradox in the Reaper scenario either, and so the argument wouldn't go through. Um, the second interpretation is incorrect for a few reasons. Suffice it to say, each Reaper is tasked with creating and placing a particle uh, at its respective region, not apart from it. I will sort of gesture at some further problems for the second interpretation, although not explain them in depth. If the task were to create a particle apart from its spatial temporal region, if no such particle has yet been placed there, then the patchwork inference would not ensure that such a particle is created. The Reaper and also the Reaper power and disposition would be clearly intrinsic, and we would have to think that Reapers could be entirely the same within their respective region, independent from whether they count as creating and placing a particle, which is implausible at best. So you could sort of maybe imagine where I'm going there with those 3 points, but I'm not going to dwell on them now since that would. I don't want to spend too much time on any particular problem, but hopefully that gives you an idea of where I'm going with that. So yeah, in sum, again, we really appreciate this comment, but yeah, neither interpretation of the relevant patchwork inference is quite correct. The first one is sort of closer to being correct, but doesn't get it quite right. And on the correct interpretation, it seems that the problem that we raise remains. So I'll leave it at that. And yeah, we'll have one more. I think this was the last one, right? Objection.
Yeah, we got one more objection that someone emailed. This person says there's a relevant dissimilarity in the justification for the possibility of an individual bulb, so P1 star, compared to the claim that Grim Reapers or Grim Messengers are individually possible, so P1. And the thought here is that, we can actually code a Grim Reaper or a Grim Messenger that is sufficient for a Benedetti-like paradox to arise if it is placed in the necessary conditions. But I can't code a bulb in the way it needs to be for a paradox to arise. Any coding of a bulb would require or would include either some check left function or transmit to right function that would dissolve the paradox. One, either by causing a non-terminating search, resulting in every bulb remaining in its default state. Two, or by introducing time such that a bulb would not be on if and only if it's off, but such that a bulb at T1 would be on if and only if it's off at T0. Or three, by resulting in a state of the system where the whole chain of bulbs oscillates between being on and off. So the thought here then is that there's an asymmetry or a symmetry breaker between the Grim Messenger kind of argument, or the GRA, and our argument, because there's an asymmetry in the justifications for P1 star and P1. And this arises from the ability to code the relevant mechanisms. The possibility of an individual Reaper or Messenger needed for a Benedetti-like paradox can be demonstrated by actually creating it, while the possibility of an individual bulb needed for a Benedetti-like paradox can't be demonstrated in such a certain way. Now, we don't really think this objection works, and there are a couple reasons why. So, first, it would only dissolve the paradox in the sense that it, as in, like the coding, right? Like the coding, any coding of a bulb would result in one of these three states, for instance. And, the objector is saying that this would dissolve the paradox. This would only dissolve the paradox in the sense that upon arranging the bulbs in a loop within the program, you would either get a code error or else some sort of consistent scenario would play out in your program, such as the one the objector mentions. But notice that the same thing is true of a code of a Reaper mechanism, right? If you program infinitely many such Reapers in a line, right? Think of something like Conway's Game of Life in an endless grid, where you code each box to do something or be in some state, if and only if none of the other boxes in the direction of beginninglessness do it or are in that state. You would also either get a code error or else some sort of consistent scenario would play out in your program, such as all of the boxes remaining in their default states or whatever. And again, this point could also be made if we could make supertask simulations. So I don't think this is a relevant difference between the two cases, right? Like coding both scenarios, a loop of bulbs and a Bernard-Eddy sequence of Reaper-like mechanisms, coding both such scenarios would involve that sort of dissolution within the code. So if the objector's point suffice to show that we can't code a bulb the way it needs to be for a paradox to arise, the same is true of Reapers. So there isn't a relevant disanalogy here. Both codes would either malfunction or do something consistent when they're arranged in the way the paradox supposes them to be arranged, either in loop or in a beginningless arrangement. So that's a first response. Second response is that we don't just need an asymmetry between the cases. We need an asymmetry that renders P1 star so much less plausible than P1 that we shouldn't believe P1 star even if we believe P1. And I just don't think the objector has provided that. At best, and ignoring our first reply, they've shown that we have extremely compelling reason to think that a Reaper mechanism is possible, namely the fact that we can code it. We are therefore basically certain that it's possible. Since we allegedly can't code a bulb, we don't have this extremely compelling reason to think that a bulb is possible. But this clearly doesn't mean that P1 star is so much less plausible than P1 that we shouldn't believe P1 star even if we believe P1. It just means that there's one particularly decisive reason to believe P1 that allegedly doesn't transmit to P1 star. But there could still be excellent reasons to accept P1 star that are also reasons, of course, to accept P1. Namely, the reasons that we cover in the article, like from conceivability and consistency and relevant similarity to lots of actual mechanical systems and modal uniformity / continuity and similarity to Reapers, which are possible given P1 and so on. And we also talk about, we talk about a lot of things in the article and in the video that we made on my channel. So even if P1 star isn't as decisively supported as P1, it can still be incredibly well supported, and well supported enough to warrant belief if we also go in for P1. So the objector actually hasn't undermined our companions in guilt argument. And I think Troy's going to add a little bit to the end of this as well. So I'll turn it over to Troy.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of reiterate something that you've already said, Joe, which is that I think plainly we just could code bulbs. It's just that our code would break or otherwise not produce results compatible with the constraints. That is if the simulated bulbs compose a loop or some other kind of paradoxical arrangement. Yeah, this isn't surprising. And as Joe said, we'd get a similar result if we tried to simulate the Grim Reaper variant, the code for which would plausibly result in a non-terminating search. But we could code Reapers and we could code bulbs. It's not hard to imagine a code given which we could simulate, say, individual bulbs and what would happen if we arrange them into lines of various lengths. The code would break or produce results not satisfying the relevant constraints if we tried to simulate a loop of bulbs, but that's the sort of right result. We would expect that. It's not a bug. It's a consequence of the fact that we're trying to simulate something inconsistent. And the fact that we couldn't, or that our code would run its own problem if we tried to do that, that wouldn't undermine the possibility of bulbs. So yeah, I think Joe pretty much said all that, but that's probably good enough for that objection. So so that's actually it for the objections we wanted to cover that we had already. I don't know how many people are actually watching, but if there's anyone here who had any questions or worries of their own, feel free to leave them. If not, we can wrap up. But I don't know.
Yeah. No, I mean, it looks like. I see someone's talking about ghosting. That's great. I am a ghoster by definition.
That's right.
So it doesn't look like we are going to be. Oh, Daniel Mancuso. He says, yeah, I have one. I can't send it all, but in parts.
Okay.
So maybe
also,
we should
if you have something, if if you actually have something long to send, you can also send it on Discord. So I know this guy.
Okay. Yeah, that is true. You could just type it up in Discord, maybe.
Yes. Yeah.
He said, wait, can I say, yeah, okay. Daniel Mancuso. That's a nice name.
It is. Yeah, it's funny because I was trying to think of just objections that I could think of, just for something else we might want to cover, but I don't know. It feels like we've already included pretty much anything.
Yeah, I think
sort of
this just
remotely
shows that our
possible.
case is just irrefutable. I mean, that's the obvious conclusion.
That's right. As you said, you've been studying this for 15 years or whatever. What was the Kuhn's line or whatever?
Yes, I've been studying this for 15 years.
Yeah. All right. So, okay, he said, this is what he wrote. He said, in the fourth objection, if we want to allow for the possibility of a bulb, it seems we would have to allow for some type of abnormal intervention. Okay, but this, oh yeah, okay. To prevent the formation of a bulb circle. But for abnormal interventions to always occur, we would need to be living in worlds with very different laws from our own. Like the issues of time travel, if it is possible for me to go back in time to kill my baby self, it may only be possible in a world with very different laws, such like ones that allow babies to revive from the dead, etc. But I would think that the appeal to these bulbs is not just that they are possible in worlds with similar laws to our own. Yet if the worlds we have to imagine are ones with drastically different laws and out there laws, one may be inclined to think that these bulbs aren't really possible because of such implications. This reminds me of the stuff from the Yale Löwenstein paper. I don't know if we talked about that before, but yeah. So just looking at this objection here, I don't suppose that it's not clear to me why the laws would have to be any different from those that are world. After all, I mean, if you look back at the like various possibilities that we raised regarding what might happen if someone were to arrange them into a circle, it seems like all of them are compatible with laws, much like the actual laws. So a person. So the first one was that the person, what was it, that they changed their mind? Oh, actually, I'll just pull it up on the slides here. Oh, it's not in the slides. It was in my response. That's right. I'll go back to that here just so I have them in the right order. Yeah, so the first possibility was that upon being arranged in a circle, at least one of the bulb would lose or fail to realize its characteristic power and disposition. The second was that any such attempt just fails. Maybe you change your mind or slip out a banana peel or the bulbs break or something like that. And the third option is that, well, upon being arranged in a circle, at least one of the bulbs ceases to exist or ceases to count as a bulb. Maybe it just counts as a regular bulb. And the point is that, look, that one of these happen at any possible world where someone attempts to arrange bulbs into a circle is, well, those are all things that could happen, and there are all things that could happen at worlds with laws very much like our own. So I don't see what case would have to be there would be for thinking that the laws would have to be very different. It seems sort of in line with the Löwenstein paper that the worry is that, well, maybe something would have to be there to ensure that one of these things invariably happens in any such scenario. And maybe that having to be the case requires very different laws or something like that. But I just don't think that's correct. I don't see why we'd have to think. And without getting into details where I think the Löwenstein paper goes wrong, I don't know if that's what this commenter is invoking, but without getting to those details, no, it's just if you just could imagine all the different possible worlds in which someone is attempting to do this sort of thing. It's true that at each of those, something or another is going to happen, which results in no such paradox arising, right? Either the bulbs lose their disposition, or the person fails to do it for some reason, or a bulb ceases to exist, or something else like that. But it has to be one of those options, because those are the only possibilities, right? That would avoid paradox. Because there's no possible world that includes the paradox. There's no possible world that includes a person successfully arrange them into a circle in this way. And so any such world that includes people attempting to arrange them in a circle this way will include, well, something that's actually possible, like the things we listed. So
Right. I mean,
hopefully that you can add
yeah,
more to that.
just to add some things. I mean, I agree with everything you said, but also, I mean, just like, again, consider Bridget trying to cross all 7 bridges of Königsberg.
Right.
It's well known that this is a mathematical impossibility. I'm sorry, I just looked at the chat, not the bicep flex. I wasn't trying to flex. That is funny. That's a good one. Okay, yeah, what was I saying? Yeah, Bridget of Königsberg. Can't cross all 7 bridges, mathematical impossibility, forms a non-Eulerian circuit, yada, yada, yada. But it's not very plausible to say, like the fact that Bridget always fails to cross all 7 bridges of Königsberg without doubling back on herself, does that somehow make it like a very different laws from our own? No, I mean, it's just like, it's mathematically impossible for Bridget to cross all 7 bridges of Königsberg without doubling back on herself. But that doesn't mean that, like, the fact that she always has to fail in this task that she's desperately trying to do. Sometimes she'll fall into the Pragal River. Sometimes she'll double back on herself on bridge number 2. Sometimes she'll get bored and give up. Sometimes she'll double back on herself on bridge number 6. Different things will happen in different circumstances, different occasions of her attempting to cross all 7 bridges without doubling back on herself. And the fact that she always fails, does nothing to say that this is, a physically impossible situation. And also, I mean, again, it's worth reading the points that we make, and with respect to like the instantaneous action at a distance point, the Reapers in Kuhn's own argument are capable of acting arbitrarily quickly, arbitrarily precisely, and that violates, well, to the extent that bulbs allegedly violate actual physical law, though those Reapers also seem to violate actual physical law. So it's also not clear to me that would represent a relevant difference between the Reapers and the bulbs. I think that's enough.
Yeah, part of what you raised there is a good point, right? Because Reapers, at least for the version with the ever smaller intervals of time, them realizing their power would require laws perhaps very different from our own. At the very least, you have to have things acting at potentially arbitrarily fast speeds over arbitrarily short periods, and yeah, that would require different physics. So maybe, well, sure, maybe they are possible also worlds with physics like our own, but so is too for bulbs.
Right. Well, this is another thing that I wanted to mention, which is like, at least it seems to me that such worlds should still be possible. I mean, like, that's another point that's going on. It's like, I would question the assumption here that, it's like a dubious possibility. That doesn't seem to me to be the case. I mean, again, like, we could appeal to these various motivations that proponents of the Grim Reaper Kalam themselves use to motivate the possibility of Reapers. We can also motivate the possibility of these different sorts of laws as well in that kind of way. So I would also challenge that aspect of this case, that it seems to me quite plausible that these other things are metaphysically possible. But I guess that's a separate kind of objection, and we don't need to rest our case on that. Now, Daniel does say in the chat, what is it to say the hands of logic must prevent the loop, if not that some abnormal interventions occur? I mean,
well, I'm not sure what abnormal intervention is. But the point is that on any occasion where someone attempts to arrange the bulbs into a loop, something happens such that doesn't happen. right?
Well,
And
something
we go over
happens
some of the
such that,
possibilities.
well, listen, that they could actually, as we point out in the paper, they could actually succeed in arranging the bulbs into a loop. It's just that either one of the bulbs, upon doing so,
Right.
would cease to be a bulb, or at least one of the bulbs would just fail to realize its power and disposition. Things fail to realize their powers and
Right.
dispositions all the time. And, things fail to be a given sortal of all the time as well. They fail to be a given kind of thing all the time. They cease being a particular kind of thing all the time. And moreover, people fail to arrange things into a circle all the time. It's not like any one of these in particular is destined to occur or something like that. It's just that, some one or other of these things is going to occur. It's exactly the same as what happens with Bridget crossing all 7 bridges of Königsberg. It's not like she's destined to fail on exactly one of the bridges, like Bridge 4 in particular. Or it's not like she's like destined to fall into the Pragal River. It's just, something or other is going to happen, which, results in her failing in her task. Either she's going to fall into the Pragal River, or she'll get bored, or someone will distract her, or, a Grim Reaper will kill her, or, or she'll double back on bridge number 1 or bridge number 7, etc. So, yeah. And again, these don't need to be like abnormal. I mean, it could be so much as someone just getting bored of their intention to arrange bulbs into a loop or something, or, and again, things fail to realize their powers and dispositions all the time. Like you strike a match and it doesn't always light, etc.
Yeah, just to sort of clarify something about the mysterious force worry, the idea is supposed to be like, look, it shouldn't be possible to arrange bulbs, at least bulbs realizing their power and disposition, into a loop like this. But like, what prevents that? Why? What sort of stays the hand of the person arranging them in that way? And the thought is supposed to be, well, it just has to be like logic doing that. Like logic itself, like principles of logic somehow influences what people do with bulbs or something like that. And again, that's a sort of a similar point that has been raised regarding the grandfather paradox in time travel. Like, well, what stays the hand of the time traveler from killing their own grandfather? Like logic, like these abstract principles sort of step in to like pull the gun down or something. It's like, no, that's ridiculous. Clearly, we don't think that logic can play that role in that case or in this case. So if the worry is that that's what have to be that's what would have to be doing this, preventing the paradox from arising, then we've gone wrong somewhere else. But our response is that no, we don't have to think that logic has to step in that way to stop the paradox from arising. The paradox just can't arise, right? And what happens instead might be a range of different things as we list, but it's something possible, right? That's sort of almost definitionally the case. And these are some of the possible things that could happen. The paradox is not one of them. That's the main
Yeah,
point.
and I mean, the things that will happen, it's just going to be a matter what exact specific thing occurs. It's just going to be a matter of contingent historical circumstance. But it's going to vary world by world, and it's just going to be one possibility occurring in one world, another possibility occurring in another world. But one thing that we know won't occur is the logically impossible situation. And again, it's not like logic is influencing any of these other particular contingent historical circumstances. Logic just constrains the realm of, like what possible worlds there are. And what exactly happens within the worlds is just that's dictated by the contingent historical circumstances that occur in the the laws, the initial conditions, and whatnot. And again, it's just I think it's a very helpful analogy to return to the Bridges of Königsberg case. Again, it's the math is not like reaching in and like pulling Bridget into the Pragal River or something like that. Like that, this is not happening. Math just constrains mathematical possibility, just constrains which of the relevant worlds are even possible worlds to begin with, and exactly what happens in any particular world with Bridget is just going to be a matter of the specific contingent historical circumstances of that world. But we know it's going to have to be one of the possible ones. So maybe in one of them, Bridget's going to fall into the Pragal River. Another one, something else happens, etc. So I think it's an informative analogy, and yeah, I mean, I think that's good. I mean, we appreciate the objection, Daniel.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I think that's probably enough, unless someone had any more comments or objections or anything, we can probably. I realize we've actually been going for a decent time, although some of that was technical issues at the beginning. But
Right.
For anyone who's watched this live or later on, hope this wasn't too niche or too dry. I hope you found it somewhat interesting. And feel free to leave any more comments or words in the comments of this video or the original video on Joe's channel where we discuss the paper. And thanks for watching. I guess we'll leave it off there. And if you want to close with anything, Joe, feel free. But
yeah, no, thanks for having me. Subscribe to both of our channels. Patronize both of us. But yeah, no. Thanks for having me on, Troy, and I really enjoyed working on this paper and these videos.
Yeah, for sure, and thanks so much for doing this, and yeah, for the paper and the videos as well. But yeah, thanks everyone for watching. I'll see you in the next one.